Dr. Wim Lavin here to address the question, why does terrorism fundamentally change the way we think about conflict and peace? So, a lot of what we talk about in these sections ends up involving kind of more of our personal lives, conflict that we might experience in our interpersonal relationships, workplaces, uh, those types of dynamics, which um, in some ways, all conflicts have kind of similar tendencies, or we can use the same types of systems for mapping conflict and apply it to groups or individuals or states and so forth. But this question here, terrorism, is really going to be about bringing something out that we don't spend a lot of time talking about in class, largely because the class isn't motivated towards, you know, policymakers. Not to say that the students couldn't become like president or senator or work for Congress or something, but just because the class is meant to be much more practical. And so some of this is going to be fundamentally different. And so I just want to be clear about that up front. The biggest part is that almost nothing that we talk about in this class, with the exception of some of the war stuff, happens at what we call the global or state level of analysis. So individual level of analysis is mostly what we deal with. So if we look at individuals, then what we experience, right? Like, is Chicago violent or peaceful? Comes from the individual perspective. People who hear gunshots feel like, yeah, it's pretty violent here. But at the state level of analysis, the U.S. is not at war because we don't have 1,000 battle deaths per year, and therefore the cities of the U.S., none of the cities are at war. So saying that we're not at war doesn't really help people who feel like that they're living in locations of proximal violence and so forth. And whether or not the textbook says that this is our academic definition of a war, it can sure feel like a war zone. But so in this portion, actually, what we're doing is we're looking at this state and international systems level of analysis. That is to say, that disputes between our countries and happen in a way that, you know, war is kind of the last measure that can be taken in responding to a problem or a conflict or a crisis in which demands aren't being met and negotiations aren't proceeding in a way that serves the parties that are involved. I don't really want to say it like war is actually justified, but the idea is that people fight to get needs met. And so historically, right, we had wars of conquest, right, that land masses were being taken over, and that there was a race to secure more territories and resources and power. But the current world is completely mapped out. Borders have been put in place. You know, that's like the first thing that the United Nations does after World War II. And it creates some conflicts, don't get me wrong, but the first thing that the United Nations does is ratify all existing boundaries, because we don't want to have border disputes. Again, I know that there are some borders in dispute, but we are not fighting because we're like finders keepers. Hey, this is our island. We found it. We got here first. Like that's all done. That's in the past. So we have the land in place. Now the conflict is people want to be able to tell each other what to do. Power is the ability to get others to do what you want them to do, right? And sometimes when you have power, then the other side says no, then you have to leverage more power. Anyway, so when states tell other states what to do and they're not getting things to play out, then this escalates, right? You do it or else what? Or else we're going to bomb you. Well, we'd like to see you try. And then they drop the bombs, and then maybe things work out, or maybe they don't. Bombs do not always yield the results that are desired. But the idea of the use of force by states is actually that they want to scare, right? I mean, it's the original definition of terrorism, to be honest. But they want to scare the other side into doing what they want to do. And they would like for the threat of force to be able to achieve the outcomes without actually having to use the force. Because, again, war is the most expensive means for achieving results, right? War is just incredibly expensive. Threatening war is strategically and significantly beneficial to actually having to fight one. Financial costs and human costs, right? People die. And we actually don't want people, or at least our own citizens, to die. I don't really think that we want other citizens to die. But if that's the means to the end, again, it's a question about the return on investment. Anyway, the thing about this is that terrorism takes the ability to have the exclusive right or the exclusive access to the use of fear or threats of violence to achieve ends away from nation states and puts it into the hands of individuals and groups. That is the fundamental shift here. For all of the verbiage about terrorism, this is the part that's most important to the class. It's that historically, states have had a monopoly on access or rights to the use of force and violence. And what terrorists have done is said, you've been using all this force against us for so long, but actually we're going to use your tools against you. And so in class, if we had a session, I would put on a knit pink hat and carry a sign. I would just walk to the door, walk across the front of the room, turn around, walk back, go out into the hallway, put my sign away, take the hat off, and go back in. And I thought about trying to model this, but it's really hard for me to lift my arms up and have it show in screen and everything. So, but just imagining me holding a sign. You could even take a second to guess, if Wim had a protest sign in 2021, what would it say, right? I haven't had to protest against Joe Biden yet. I protested against Donald Trump a lot. But what would my sign say? The sign I loved carrying into class the most was the I support Planned Parenthood sign. Creates its own kind of conversation. But anyway, so the sign, right, is the idea of raising awareness and educating people about a problem. Hey, politicians, women need access to affordable birth control and health care. That's important to me. I'm a man, but my life is better when women have access to birth control. It's important to me. I'm holding a sign. You know another person cares. So people can carry signs, right? And sometimes we have protests in this country that can have as many as 1 million people, right? And then you see strength in numbers and so forth. And maybe not all of the individual signs get read, or maybe the more artistic ones get read. But there's no guarantee. There's no guarantee that that sign will be read, or that if the people reading those signs will change anything, no matter the size of the group. Like, like protesters in Yemen calling for an end to the armed violence that's causing so many innocent people to be killed and starve to death because they don't have access to food. So they can carry signs like "Stop killing us." But the thing is that the signs aren't changing the behavior. So they could protest, they could protest, they could protest. They can get journalists to come in, get footage out, show the atrocities. Famous example of this, 1994, Rwanda has genocide taking place. Journalists put their lives on the line to go out there and capture this graphic violence of the brutal violence of people being hacked up with machetes. They thought for sure it's worth sacrificing or risking our lives to get this out, because as soon as the global community sees what's happening here, they will react. And they didn't. The global community failed. The global community saw that a genocide was taking place and did not intervene. And there's a lot of different reasons that doesn't happen. But again, the failure is at the state level. Lots of individuals see violence and they are appalled and they turn away, they can't take it, and then they have nightmares and they cry and they think, like, what kind of world are we raising our kids in? But the individuals, even if they make phone calls or say do something, this is horrible, they don't get it stopped. And people aren't stupid. They see our protest signs aren't working. You're not listening to us. So what we're going to do is we're going to invest in the mechanisms of violence. You wouldn't listen to 100 people carrying signs, but you will listen to one person carrying a machine gun. Or you will read the manifesto of the person who leaves an explosive in a building. And it works. People have figured out that they can be easily ignored as poor people who are dying, but it's harder to ignore them when they are people with weapons who are doing violence. Osama bin Laden brought the U.S. government to its knees. George W. Bush will never come out and give a speech that says Osama bin Laden won. But when Osama bin Laden made a manifesto of demands that included things like get the U.S. troops out of Saudi Arabia, and he hijacked, or his network hijacked, airplanes and crashed them into targets, he got what he wanted. George W. Bush, in starting wars in countries that were not responsible for the terrorism that happened on September 11th, he took the troops out of Saudi Arabia. He gave Osama bin Laden his victory. Terrorists fundamentally change the way we think about conflict and peace, because violence, for as much as I hate it, is highly effective. The path to destruction is much easier than the path to creation. Terrorists achieve results. Part of the achievement that they have is that they can cause others to suffer. They may not ever through violence get their own needs met, but they can get others to feel pain. And revenge can be an extremely powerful motivator. People who have lost loved ones, who see the injustice in the world, the cruelty of a planet that allows these things to happen, will then be motivated not for their own earthly possessions, but to cause those who have made them suffer to suffer. I don't want to call it a rational need. I just want to explain part of the psychology. Terrorism changes the way we think about peace and conflict because it creates conditions where Violence can be an end in and of itself, and this creates a fundamental challenge for our ability to problem solve. It takes behaviors that we would seek to condemn and that we would like to be able to, right, as an international system. When I say we, I mean the globe would like, right, the powers that be would love to be able to say to terrorist groups, do what I say or else. But it's different, right? A weaker nation has to cave to the force and the compelling words of the stronger nation. But terrorist groups don't have borders. You can bomb a state, but you can't really bomb a terrorist organization, right? They cross borders. They exist. They can disappear and resurface. It's a different kind of target, and it's willing to steal the power of the use of force and violence, but it's also in some ways immunized to the reaction of violence and coercive force. Right? We've heard this in protests over the last few years about Antifa is not a organization, it's an ideology. And terrorist organizations work the same way. As long as the ideology exists, it's still there. You could kill every single last member, but the ideology, recorded, written, or whatever, can resurface, right? You can't permanently suppress it, or you can't permanently suppress it with the use of force. So it creates a challenge, because we have to think about the causes of terrorism, the roots of terrorism, and we have to think about how that relates to our study of peace and conflict in the world. And it changes the narrative. We have to change the narrative from terrorists just being the axis of evil to rational actors advocating for or attempting to address their interests, wants, and needs, which makes people very, very uncomfortable. Right? It's seen as the illegitimate use of force, but it's an effective tool for interrupting the establishment that some would seek to undermine or retaliate against. It's a big challenge. See you in the next one.